Hello. On behalf of myself and Editor-in-Chief of The Australian, Michelle Gunn, welcome to Defending Australia, a pre-election special event. I'm Gemma Jones and I'm Editor of The Advertiser here in Adelaide. First, I acknowledge we meet on the lands of the Kaurna people, and I pay my respects to Elders, past and present. I'm delighted to welcome you to Sir Keith Murdoch House. Deputy Prime Minister and Defence Minister, the Honourable Richard Marles, welcome, and to your counterpart, the Shadow Defence Minister and the Honourable Andrew Hastie. Welcome to the Premier of South Australia, the Honourable Peter Malinauskas, and South Australian Treasurer and Defence Minister Stephen Mulligan. I give special thanks to the members of... We've got an audio issue. The best laid plans. I give special thanks to the members of our Defence Forces here, Vice Admiral Jonathan Mead, Director General of the Australian Submarine Agency. It's great to have you here. We are joined by Their Excellencies Vasil Miroshnichenko, Ukraine's Ambassador to Australia, and Pontus Melander, Swedish Ambassador to Australia. Other members of Parliament include Senators Marielle Smith and David Fawcett. We are joined by numerous CEOs and leaders from the defence industry companies. Welcome to Craig Lockhart, from CEO BAE Systems, Matt Opie, Chief Executive Defence SA, and his team, including his advisor, Lieutenant General retired Rick Burr, AO, former Chief of the Army. Andy Keogh, Saab Australia CEO, Dennis Cleary, Hanwha Defence Australia Legal and Commercial Director, ASC representatives, Andrew Cridland, Babcock Australasia CEO, Phil Roberts, Deloitte National Sector Leader for Defence and SA Managing Partner, Henry Menz, Jim Wally, Nova Systems, co-founder, Andrew Seaton, ANI CEO, last but certainly not least, Melissa Lebrandi, Managing Director, News Corp South Australia, and Darren Davidson, Managing Editor of Commercial and Commercial Director for The Australian. Australia's defence and security have always been topics of critical national importance, but particularly in this time of gathering storms in Europe, the Middle East, and in our own region. We meet today having seen our greatest alliance with the United States tested, a world order being realigned in worrying ways, and all of this happening as Australia undertakes to build up capability to ensure peace in the Pacific into the future. Journalists play an important role in public discourse on these critical issues. These accomplished journalists include my colleague, Advertiser Editor-at-Large, Paul Starrick, who has covered naval shipbuilding in South Australia for more than 30 years. Our drive at The Advertiser is to spread the word about the critical skills needed to build nuclear submarines in Adelaide and the great opportunity of high-paid, high-skilled jobs in this great state. I'm extremely proud today to present Defending Australia as a joint advocacy series between The Advertiser and News Corp's national flagship masthead, The Australian, which is the home of a small army of specialist journalists in defence and national security. It is a pleasure to have two brilliant operators here today, Chief International Correspondent Cameron Stewart and Foreign Affairs and Defence Correspondent Ben Packham. Can I welcome Cameron now to host our first panel with the Defence Minister and the Premier. Thank you.
Up here. Okay, there we are. Okay, well, thank you very much. I mean, we can't get two more distinguished chaps to talk about these issues than the Deputy Prime Minister and the Premier. So thank you both very, very much.
Thanks, Cam.
I'm going to bounce a few different questions off you both. Minister, if I can start with you first. We're coming into an election. Eldridge Colby, the Trump's number 3 pick in the Pentagon, has said today that Australia should go to 3% of GDP in defence spending. We've had Keir Starmer, the UK Prime Minister, talking 2.5 to 3. We're having European nations talking a lot about greater defence spending and a generational threat. Is there not an argument, even though you've increased defence spending in your government, to ramp it up further?
Well, firstly, we have increased defence spending, as you said, Cam, under our government. It's an additional $50 billion over the decade, which is now actually in the budget. And to contextualise that's the biggest increase in defence spending in our peacetime history. So it's not a small thing that we have done. And it came, off the back of, to be frank, a decade of dysfunction in terms of the management of the defence budget, in many respects the cutting of the defence budget. I think the way I'd answer the question in a broader sense, though, is that I've often said in a rational world, defence spending is a function of strategic threat, strategic complexity, and there's no doubt that we live in a strategically complex and threatening world. And so I understand very much the position that America is taking. I think it is completely reasonable that America is asking its friends and allies around the world to do more. We're totally willing to engage in that conversation with the United States, which we've already started. When I met with my counterpart, Secretary Pete Hegseth, a few weeks ago, we talked about defence spending, and there was a total acknowledgement of what we are doing in terms of lifting that trajectory. I think this ends up being an ongoing conversation. I would also, though, just point out that Bridge Colby in his testimony, which is where he made the comments that he made, also very clearly supported AUKUS, and as did Pete Hegseth in his meeting with me. AUKUS is not the whole story, but it is a part of the story of our ramping up of defence spending, and it is a driver in the increase of Australia's military capability. It is also a driver in an increase in Australia's defence spending.
So would you rule out any increase beyond what's already been projected before the election?
Well, I mean, we've got the increases that we have that takes us across the decade, and they are in the budget. As I say, this is an evolving situation, and we will continue to have that conversation. I think what actually matters right now is that this become a bipartisan position in Australia, and at this moment in time, the opposition have not committed to the additional $50 billion in spending that we've committed to. In fact, they quite stubbornly talk about the envelope that they took to the last election, which is $50 billion less, and we really need to see the increases that we have done locked into the budget going forward.
Now you've been trying to get firepower more quickly, trying to fast-track that capability. The Coalition has said they'll want a fourth squadron of joint strike fighters. Does the government support that concept, and if not, why not?
Well, this was policy on the run, on the part of the opposition. I mean, once there are questions about whether there is money to sustain these F-35s, whether there's money to house them, whether there is money to have the pilots which would actually fly them, what is clear is that there's none of that money. And this isn't going to shock you. An F-35 which is sitting on the ground doesn't do anything. But the other point here is that the Coalition are there saying we need defence capability right now. I've got to break it to Peter Dutton. When you go to the F-35 shop to buy the F-35s, you can't get one tomorrow. This is not capability that he's talking about bringing into being for years and years to come. What we have been focused on, as you rightly say, Cam, is actually building our capability to project and to strike. We need to match our physical capability with the humans that we've got to operate them. There is no point in having F-35s if you don't have the pilots to fly them. And when the Coalition were in power, they presided over a shrinking defence force. Like that is the reality. We've been focused on the guided weapons and explosive ordnance enterprise. We have funded that significantly, which gives Australia a much longer range strike capability, which will see us do much more in terms of ensuring that we have the war stocks necessary. That improves our capability, and that is an example of where we are prioritising our spending, as of course we are in building a long-range capable submarine, which is and a much more capable surface fleet. These are the things that give us projection right now. An additional squadron of F-35s without pilots to fly them at some unnamed point in the future does nothing to add to Australia's projection, our lethality, our capability.
Premier, AUKUS has many moving parts. You once said what worries you most is the ability to get enough trained, skilled nuclear and general shipbuilding skilled workers. As we've moved on, is that still your main concern? What keeps you up at night with AUKUS?
Definitely still that, no doubt about it. But I think we're in a stronger position today than where we were 12 months ago, because there is now things happening on the ground. I think that people in positions like mine, I think the Premier of South Australia in particular, when we think about the AUKUS opportunity, the particular responsibility that we have is around education, training and skills. That sits squarely within the remit of state government, within the Federation. And I think whoever occupies my office needs to have a permanent state of anxiety to make sure we're doing everything we can, given the size and the scale of the challenge. Notwithstanding that, I draw comfort from the fact that we're starting to see some of the investments that have been made by both the Commonwealth and the South Australian Government being built, leading to outcomes. And the one that I would point to, and people in this room, particularly Craig Lockhart, would be most familiar with, is what we've done down at Findon. I mean, there is a technical college that we committed to our election 3 years ago. It is literally, as we speak, open, running, taking in the second set of intakes. We have got kids who are lined up. Some of them already working at BAE with a guaranteed job, and we only, 3 years ago that didn't even exist. Now it's a physical piece of infrastructure with kit and equipment that precisely replicates what BAE have at the frigate yard. So, things are starting. And then, of course, today, the most important milestone, after a lot of work between governments and the ASA, today turning the sod on what will be a 20,000 square metre facility that trains 800 to 1,000 young people, predominantly South Australian young people, to be able to work on building the most complex machines in the history of the world. I mean, that is happening, and that's a $480 million investment from the Fed. So
you're moving as fast as you can down that track. But unfortunately, the lesson of history is a difficult one, isn't it? I mean, the ADF struggles to get its own recruitment targets, and especially in the technical sphere, we see when there's a boom, the mining industry steals these technicians. Yep. I mean, you do have a historical challenge here. Are you confident that the base blocks are there to succeed?
Yes, but again, see, one of the virtues of this industry being based in South Australia is that we don't necessarily have the same scale of competition in terms of the mining sector that we see in Western Australia today.
Yeah.
If everything goes according to plan from our perspective, the big copper opportunity that we're working on with BHP, which is now their principal path to growth, as stated by them, 10 years' time from now, we hope that it is a major employer. So, which comes back to, we need a lot more people in our state. That's not a popular thing to say in the context of domestic politics, unless, of course, people draw some confidence from the planning policy that sits around it, which goes to housing. I mean, people in this room would appreciate that now housing policy in South Australia is actually critical to defence industry policy for the nation, which is why we've got to be tackling all those things. But I would say we're in a good position, but I'm not going to deny the fact that there is a huge amount of work that still needs to be done.
Minister, I was going to ask, do you trust Donald Trump when it comes to his support for AUKUS?
Well, I do. And, when you look at the statement that was made by Bridge Colby today, when you look at the statement that was made by Secretary Hegseth when he and I met, and it was really a fantastic meeting. It was a fantastic meeting in terms of the shared sense of mission around our alliance, very much including AUKUS. I thought it was a really good meeting in terms of the focus that this administration has on the Indo-Pacific, which obviously is welcome from our point of view. So I actually have a sense of confidence about where we can take the alliance under the Trump administration and the alignment of effort in terms of the focus that we're bringing to bear in terms of our own security, but what the United States is doing in terms of its focus on the Indo-Pacific.
Can I ask a question? I was thinking about this today after our press conference. Every single time Richard or I have stood up announcing some progress milestone in terms of AUKUS, or any other time on radio in South Australia an event has occurred where AUKUS becomes a topic of conversation, I get asked that question. I'm not too sure what more needs to be done before those questions stop. I mean, all three countries have gone through a change in administration or government from one political party to the other, and not one word has been uttered by any Prime Minister, any Defence Minister or Defence Secretary or the US President of either political persuasion that has actually said anything on the record that would suggest that AUKUS isn't an ongoing commitment. And yet, while I can understand there's desire to ask the question, given that things can change quickly, evidently. Nonetheless, there's been no suggestion that this is going to be an issue.
Sure, but Premier Colby today spoke about the fact that he thought it was great to sell Virginia-class submarines to Australia, but he said, you know, if the production of those submarines is not fast enough, that might be a problem for the US. I mean, that comes to a central question as to trust in future administrations to actually sell those submarines if the Virginia rollout is not fast enough. Minister?
Yeah, I mean, I can understand those comments, but in a sense, let's think that through. I mean, it is really, I think, the beauty of the optimal pathway that we announced in March of 23, that there really is something in it for all three countries. You know, we are playing a very significant role now in increasing the production rate and the sustainment rate of Virginia-class submarines in America for America. That's something that they acknowledge. That is something which is utterly different to any other relationship they have with literally any other country when it comes to their bilateral defence relationships. And it is clearly acknowledged in the conversation. The strategic benefit to the United States of AUKUS is really understood by the United States. And, you know, if the production rates don't increase in relation to Virginia's, as you know, both Pete and I were saying to each other, you know, there's a whole lot of issues that America faces in that moment. But what AUKUS is about is ensuring that we jointly succeed on that effort. It is in Australia's interest that America has a greater availability of Virginia-class submarines. You know, we need America to be the most capable they can be, and America needs us to be the most capable we can be. And they're fundamentally, you know, I think you used the word trust. Trust is actually at the heart of the relationship, and you know, maybe that kind of sounds twee and trite, but it really strikes me in all the conversations I have how there is something that will happen at the beginning of the conversation which is really an expression of trust. The very first thing that Pete Hegseth said to me when we spoke to each other over the phone was his working with Australian servicemen and women when he was serving in Afghanistan. You know, there is a really strong, trusted perspective of Australia, and we should not, you know, underestimate the significance of that. And you know, to Pete's point, I mean, we do keep getting asked those questions. I kind of get that we will get those questions. I mean, it is a lot of money. It goes over a long period of time. But what I'm really confident about is we'll answer those questions. That means something. What means much more is the actions that we put into place, and that is what's occurring.
So let me ask you both something that isn't often asked. Public support for AUKUS is hugely important going forward. Now, whatever polls has been done, there's not very good ones, shown a bit of a softening, but not too much. But when people are asked about the price of the submarines, their support for the concept falls a lot. I guess what I wanted to ask you both, are you confident going forward that public support will still be strong for such a massive defence program? Again, I think these things depend on how they're presented. I mean, you can calculate a very big number over a very long period of time, which you can do in relation to any piece of public expenditure there is. When you talk to people about the fact that we're looking at taking defence spending from 2 to 2.3, 2.4% of GDP, and that what we are talking about here is 0.15% of GDP, that's what the AUKUS program is. And that this gives us the most transformational capability that we have within our Defence Force. It is the single biggest lifting of Australian defence capability. People get that. And I think there's actually support for the expenditure in those terms, and that's what we're spending. I actually think when you go out and talk about an increase in defence spending, and you've got Andrew here, you can ask him this question as well, I think essentially there is public support for that. And what you'll hear from, in our differing ways, from both Andrew and I during the course of however long there is between now and the next election, we will both talk about the importance of AUKUS. We will both lean into that. That says something about our respective perceptions of how AUKUS is seen out there, and we will both lean into the idea of you need to spend more on defence. And Premier in South Australia?
I'll say two things. In Sydney, it's 0.15% of GDP. In Adelaide, it's over $300 billion. because the lion's share of that, of course, is going to be spent here, and that's only good news for the state. Look, the Defence Minister is spot on. For as long as there is bipartisanship, this program, in terms of public support, will be okay. And I don't see that eroding. What I think needs to happen in terms of the bipartisan support of AUKUS translating to public sentiment is the people appreciating that there isn't really another option for us to have a submarine capability outside of AUKUS. You know, there have been some pretty prominent opinion writers and even very senior politicians argue the case that we should be buying something off the shelf. Well, that's just not an option in the real world. There is no, to use your language, there is no submarine shop where you can go and purchase a submarine. Everyone's building them flat strapped for themselves, which means we need to be able to build it for ourselves if indeed we choose to have a submarine capability. And there is not an Australian that I've met who doesn't think that an island continent in this particular region at this moment in time shouldn't have a submarine capability. So I think the support is there. The best thing where we can do to solidify it is for the rest of the country, outside of South Australia and Western Australia, to develop an appreciation that this is an economic opportunity as much for them as it is for ourselves.
I'll go to the questions on the floor in a minute. Minister, I wanted to ask you just quickly about Ukraine. Your government said it's open to the concept, maybe, of joining in the peacekeeping force, if indeed there is such a force. Why is the government open to that when the Americans asked us to send a boat to the Red Sea, we said no, saying that our defence is much more important to be focused on the region?
Well, in terms of the latter assertion, I think we need to be kind of clear about exactly what America asked. We are focused, and it is part of what comes out of the Defence Strategic Review and is now in the National Defence Strategy. We are very much focused on the Indo-Pacific. We are focused on our strategic task, and that is to build a defence force which can resist coercion from any potential adversary. Now, we see that what is happening in Ukraine is relevant to that. It's relevant to that because the global rules-based order that is so central to our national interest as an island trading nation, where there's a physical manifestation, and that's our sea lines of communication, freedom of navigation goes directly to our national prosperity, where all of that is under pressure in our region and all of that is on trial in Ukraine. Now, we have been supporting Ukraine from the get-go and we will continue to support Ukraine. Right now, there are Australian personnel in Britain who are involved in the training of new recruits to the Ukrainian Armed Forces. So we actually have Australian servicemen and women committed right now. The only point we've made is that as we listen to our partners, which over the last 3 years has been the United States, but our partners in Europe, including the United Kingdom, including Ukraine itself, when they have asked for support, we have considered that and worked out how we can do it. And if there is a request of this kind, we'll do the same. We'll consider it and work out if we can make a contribution.
And on that line, if the US military aid to Ukraine continues to be frozen, would that be a reason for Australia to consider an increase of military aid to Ukraine?
Well, I mean, I think the fundamental answer here is we will continue to support Ukraine for as long as it takes for Ukraine to resolve this conflict on its terms. And again, it's an understandable question that's been consistently asked of me during the last 3 years, and we have consistently been announcing packages of support for Ukraine, the latest of which was the Abrams tanks. Of course, we announced that our embassy will be returning to Kyiv and now has back in December. We will continue to go down this path, and as requests are made of us by Ukraine itself or by our partners who are supporting Ukraine, we'll consider them.
Okay, let's go to the floor. Does anyone here want to ask a question of the Deputy Prime Minister or the Premier? Oh, well, that's great. I've got some more time. Are you quite sure? Put a hand up if you want. Okay.
Very good.
Minister, I'll ask you, the Chinese warship that we saw circulating Australia, how often have we seen that before?
Well, we've seen Chinese warships in the vicinity of Australia before. There was I guess a surveillance ship from the PLAN that was in the vicinity of Australia back in May of 2022. It's not something, I would describe it as an unusual event. It's not a completely unprecedented event though. When it became clear that a task group was coming to Australia, we, in an unprecedented way, made a decision, and it was very much a direction of mine, to make sure that we were surveilling this to the greatest possible extent. We did that, and I did that because it appeared to me at the outset that there was the prospect of this task group being in the vicinity of Australia for some time. We needed to do two things, which is what we have done. The first was to prioritization to ensure that the task group complied with international law at all times, and I'm advised that they have, and that is important to understand. And secondly, to get a clear understanding of what the task group is trying to achieve in its mission by looking at exactly where it goes, its configurations, the training and the activities that it's undertaken. And we've had a close eye on all of that, which of course is our right. I'd make this point as well though. International law has to be our touchstone here. It has to be our touchstone because there is much more often Australian Navy ships in the vicinity of China than there are Chinese Navy ships in the vicinity of Australia.
Do we do live firing exercises there? Up there?
We do live firing exercises on the high seas, which is what China did. But we also were not happy about the notice that was given by the Chinese Navy in that particular event, and we made our concerns known to China, both in Canberra and Beijing, and at the level of our foreign ministers. But I come back to the point. We are much more present in the vicinity of China than China is in the vicinity of Australia. And that's not gratuitous, that's for a reason, because that's where our trading routes are. And it's really important that we are in a position to continue to assert freedom of navigation in and around our trading routes. So for that to occur, to continue, international law has to be our touchstone and our bedrock. And that's, so we're taking this very seriously. We've surveilled this in a way that was not done previously under the former government. But equally, we're not kind of breathlessly trying to ham this up either. And it's really important that we observe the fact that they have been maintaining their obligations in respect of international law, and that's relevant in the context of what we seek to do in the proximity of China.
And that's fair enough, sure. But you've seen what they were doing, and I think you said a couple of days ago you're trying to find out a bit more about exactly what they were doing. But is it cricket? I mean, are they trying to send a message, or is this just bog standard Navy drills?
I'm not saying that. I think it is really important to conduct this surveillance to properly understand exactly what they were doing, what they were practicing, and I think from there to understand what message, if any, is being sent to us. And I'm not going to kind of leap into that and speculate about that before we get the proper assessments coming through in respect of what we have observed. I'm not for a moment, and I don't want to be seen as suggesting that this is standard. That is not my position. It is the case that they've complied with international law. We're not going to fall into the trap of breathlessly kind of complaining about activities which are in compliance with international law, which would lead us to being in a compromised position in terms of what we seek to do within the vicinity of China. That said, we are clearly going to observe this really carefully, which we have been doing, to understand exactly what's going on and to understand exactly what was being practiced and what messages are being sent. And there's nothing, I'm not at all sanguine about all of that.
And the last question I wanted to ask you is actually an offshoot of AUKUS and the South Australian project too, which we really haven't heard much about, and that's actually keeping the Collins-class fleet afloat and lethal for a lot longer. Now, what they're going to have to do with the so-called LOAT is the most technologically advanced thing they've ever done with the Collins, and I think in Australia. How do you both think this will evolve? I mean, do you really think that this is a doable mission?
Yeah, look, it's a completely fair question. It is a challenge to say at the outset, and I don't think it's unfair the way you've characterised it. I mean, this is a technologically challenging thing that we're trying to do with Collins to extend its life beyond what was imagined, and that is because of the capability gap that was opened up over the last decade as we really flipped and flopped in terms of what decision was ultimately made about our future submarines. We are now on a firm path. So to extend Collins' life, and that is part of ensuring that we do not have a capability gap, is indeed a challenge. Is it doable? I do think it's doable. I think we're going to have to be really smart and really clever in the way in which we do it, so that we, in my mind, I think that what I think is the bottom line is that if you take this moment in time today and a moment in the 2040s when we've got the full fleet of submarines, that nuclear-powered submarines occupying the entirety of our Navy submarine capability, that between now and then there is an upwardly evolving submarine capability, that we are getting stronger at every point. Extending Collins is a critical part of that. I do think it is doable to see that trajectory grow. It's a completely fair question, and it is a big challenge, but I think we can do it.
And Premier, my last question to you is, are you worried that West Australia is cutting your lunch on shipbuilding?
No. No, I'm not. The reason why I say that, and this is a bit sort of counterintuitive for a South Australian Premier to say, but the challenge for us is getting all the work done that we've now got coming our way. And I think, given the context we're now in terms of geopolitically, geostrategically, we've got to start looking at this nation's shipbuilding effort as being something that is a truly national enterprise rather than some sort of piece of competitive federation, because there is so much work that needs to be done with an enormous degree of urgency, fundamentally in the national interest, that we are far better off actually working collaboratively amongst jurisdictions just to get it all done. And with the general purpose frigate that is set to be built in Western Australia, that's fine, because here we've got LOTE, we've got the AW or the Hobart class upgrade, and then of course AUKUS. That's unlike anything that any shipbuilding industry in the history of the Southern Hemisphere has ever seen, and it's happening in a jurisdiction that is comparatively small to our interstate counterparts. So my message, in actual fact, to go one step further again, is to the Victorian state government, the New South Wales state governments, those two in particular, get on board AUKUS. Work out what part of your skills make up, what part of your industry can participate in the AUKUS and Hunter efforts, because we're going to need every bit of it to be able to get it done on time.
Which reflects the US submarine model, which outsources an awful lot around the country.
It does, and there's no one in Newport News sitting around looking for work, or in Connecticut. So the best thing that can happen for the South Australian economy is for this program to work and everyone around the country to see the value in it. That's in South Australia's interests. When people in Melbourne and Sydney and Brisbane are waking up thinking AUKUS is great because we've got all this work here too, that means it's more likely to be getting done on time in South Australia in a way that maintains the bipartisan position. So I think it's, and apart from all that, right, turn on the television set and realise just how important this is now. So it's got to be a national endeavour. So the West can have the general purpose frigate and we'll have all the complex stuff.
Okay. Minister, Premier, thank you very much for giving us your insights. Can we please show our appreciation?
Good.
Thanks, mate.
Thanks, Cam.
Thank you to the Defence Minister, the Premier and to Cameron for that. It's great to canvass everything from increasing defence spending to the US Defence Secretary's views of Australia and AUKUS, and also to hear from the Premier on the housing and skills issues at home. That would be a very big thumbs up from the advertiser on a bigger population here. Can I now invite Andrew Hastie and Ben Packham to the stage for our second panel.
Gemma. Welcome, Andrew Hastie.
Thanks, Ben. Good to be here.
Thanks for joining us. 2 seconds. We'll probably just kick off on the budget theme. It seems to be the theme of the day. You've said that the Coalition will spend more on defence than Labor. As we heard earlier, Donald Trump's number 3 Pentagon pick, Elbridge Colby, said in his confirmation hearing today that Australia needed to ramp up defence spending to around 3% of GDP. Will the Coalition get us there?
Look, we've already indicated very publicly that we will increase defence expenditure. We gave a hint of that over the weekend with the additional $3 billion committed towards the acquisition of the 4th Squadron of F-35s, but we'll announce our full costings and our budgetary plan in due course closer to the election.
A whole 1%, that's quite a big leap. Where does the money come from, do you think, to get the defence budget up to that sort of a level?
That's a good question, and I'm sure the Deputy Prime Minister's working that through as well, because it's a message to Australia from Bridge Colby, who's going to take a very central part in the Trump administration. So we've got our plan. We're going to announce that in due course, and you won't be getting a scoop here, Ben, sorry to say.
Okay. Are you already understating your defence spending commitments? Labor says the extra 28 JSFs will cost more like $7.2 billion than the $3 billion that's been nominated by the Coalition. And Labor also says you're yet to back $50 billion in additional defence spending that they've announced over the decade. So where do things stand?
Well, the Albanese government has presided over $80 billion worth of reprioritisations or cuts already. So we're just simply restoring the 4th Squadron, which was cut as part of the Defence Strategic Review. The real numbers to look at is what the Albanese government is spending over the forward estimates. It's $5.7 billion, and $3.8 billion of that will be done in the 4th year. This financial year is only $400 million, which won't even cover inflation. So the real figures you've got to study are those committed to over the forward estimates. And as for the $50 billion over 10 years, well, to quote Top Gun, or to paraphrase it, the Deputy Prime Minister is writing cheques that he can't cash because neither of us have a guarantee that we'll be around in 10 years' time to realise that. So the money that really counts is what's in the forward estimates, and we're actually going backwards, not forwards.
Okay, just on those Joint Strike Fighters, some commentators say that there are a lot of things that you should spend your money on first before you get to that, including drones and missiles. What do you say to that? And does the pledge for these additional aircraft reflect an old-school bias to exquisite manned platforms?
Not at all. I think the 4th Squadron is important. We need to have depth in the capability. But we need to look at other capabilities as well, missiles, but also drones. And I think when it comes to defence industry policy, comparative advantage is not discovered by the market, it's actually determined by the government. And I think there's areas that we can focus on as a country as we revive our industrial base and become world-leading experts at those capabilities, and then export them potentially as part of Pillar 2 in AUKUS and also more broadly to other allies around the world. So I'm pretty open-minded on what that looks like. That's what defence industry policy is all about. It's about determining what you want to be good at, what your comparative advantage is. And I think given our geography, given what we've provided to Ukraine, some of our small to medium enterprises here in this country, I think drones is something that we need to look at because we are a massive continent. We have 27 million people here. We don't have the mass that other countries can generate. And so we've got to look at asymmetric capabilities, and I think drones and missiles are definitely part of that solution going forward.
So just a bit about your own personal experience. You're a former SAS captain with experience in combat. You're a creature of the ADF's most storied unit. Do you think this is an advantage or a disadvantage for a defence minister? Peter Dutton, when he was minister, was very wary of having too many defence staffers in his office, for example. Do you think that it sort of puts you at risk of being sort of co-opted by the top brass and the secretaries and so forth?
It's a good question. I think the benchmark for any successful minister has to be their ability to set political objectives, to communicate those political objectives, to prosecute those political objectives, and to build a network to achieve those objectives. It doesn't matter what background you come from. Paul Keating never went to university, for example. Abraham Lincoln never went to university. So your background before politics has obviously a shaping influence, but really how you perform in the context of the Parliament and then the Ministry is something that you have to demonstrate every single day. So I'm glad and I'm very grateful to the Australian people for providing my early formative experiences as a leader in very difficult situations. So I feel I'm at an advantage in the sense that I've felt the fear and experienced the danger and the risk on operations. But most importantly as a minister is your ability to prosecute the political agenda. And that's what I want to be judged by, not whether I've served in uniform before. And I should say as well, I've been a parliamentarian longer than I was ever a commissioned officer. And I see Parliament and politics as my vocation.
It was a very formative experience for you. I mean, do you think it's sort of, do you feel still part of that defence community and in being part of that that very sort of small section of the community, will you really be able to kind of crack heads when you need to?
You mean, am I going to take orders from senior officers who were senior to me when I was in the Defence Force? No, I won't, and I hope that's very clear. The Minister has their responsibilities, and I see my role as not to out-general the generals, out-secretary the secretary, out-compete industry. It's a very, very, and I'm sure Richard would agree with me, it's a very limited role that you have as the Minister, but it's critical, and it's about setting the agenda and driving the agenda. And that's what I want to be judged by. If we change government, I hope we do.
You've been quite direct in your attacks on Anthony Albanese and Richard Marles, accusing them of weak leadership. You said it recently in relation to the Chinese warships. How do you think the government has been weak, and what would you do differently on defence?
Well, I think the Prime Minister failed to stand up for the national interest, and he failed to insist on mutual respect. Now, the Deputy Prime Minister said that we often do patrols up in waters that are contested under international law as part of multilateral formations or groupings. And my understanding is whenever we've done live fire in that context, it's always been deconflicted, controlled, and as part of a wider coalition. For example, we're not off the coast of China disrupting their commercial flight path. And so the issue was that we didn't get notice and it disrupted our commercial flight path. And I think the message is quite clear from the Chinese government. They're now a global power with a blue water navy. They're projecting deep into our waters. And this happened at the same time, of course, that Donald Trump was resetting relationships in Europe with NATO. And I think it was a test for us. There's a reason why they sailed past the Philippines, through the Arafura Sea, the Coral Sea, down past Sydney, and they've circumnavigated the country as well. So I think there's a message there. And I think the average person on the street with a PhD in life got the message pretty loud and clear.
So Anthony Albanese should have taken it up to the Chinese leadership personally? Is that what you're suggesting?
That's what we've suggested. That's right. Pick up the phone, make the call. He was at pains to explain it away, as within international law. Okay, we get that. That's the way they operate. But the message was very clear, particularly because it was through a Virgin flight that we were alerted that there was a live fire exercise underway.
The personnel crisis that Defence is facing, it's one of the biggest challenges facing the ADF, and it could seriously limit our capability ambitions. This isn't a new thing. It was a problem under the former government too. What would the Coalition do differently to get more Australians into uniform? Is it about offering more money, lowering standards? What's the plan?
I think there's a range of things. We are having a recruiting crisis, and last year 90% of ADF applicants withdrew their application from Defence. We're at 58,000. We need to grow to 80,000 by 2042, and we're slipping behind each year that goes by. I think we need to challenge this generation of Australians to service, fairly old school values of serving your country, defending your country, being part of this great Anzac tradition which has been handed down to us. I think that's really important. If you look back into the 80s, Bob Hawke did a recruiting ad for the Ready Reserve. He's flying in a helicopter and saying the greatest risk to Australian national security was apathy. I'd love to see the Deputy Prime Minister in a helicopter calling on young Australians to join up. But the point is, and the point I'm making is, that political leadership matters here, and if we're not getting a signal from the government that service in the ADF is important, it's a really great opportunity to grow as a person, And of course there are benefits as well, but when every ad is about self-actualisation rather than service, if it's not a challenging a challenge given to these young people, they're not going to take it up. Last week I met with some retired naval officers who said the reason why they joined was there was a recruiting ad, I think it was in the 80s, cold, wet and homesick. And they said, I wanted that challenge, that's why I joined up. I also think there's big problems within recruiting itself. Administrative bungles, people being basically eliminated because of previous medical records, which I think are quite trivial. So there's a risk aversion within the actual contractors who run recruiting, and I think we should have more uniforms against that problem, just like the Marine Corps do. They put their best officers and their best enlisted against the problem. They give them targets, and it's a part of progression for them in their careers.
The government's been saying that there was something like 64,000 applications to join the ADF last year, which sounded fantastic. But when you dig away at those numbers, a very large number of those actually pulled out before they got to the recruitment gate. How do we fix that situation?
Well, this has been a 25-year problem, because when I joined the ADF, I had the same issues. My paperwork was lost several times. I had to have one of my mates who had a father in the army call up recruiting, and I even threatened to go to my local member, who was Anthony Albanese at the time, and that got recruiting moving pretty quick, I've got to tell you. The point is, we need more leadership, and we need uniform personnel to have control about who they select and bring in. And I just think this is something that is so important, it can't be left to civilian contractors who potentially don't understand the service ethos or what young Australians are looking for when they walk through the door of a recruitment centre. So
you would remove recruiting from the...
It's an option. All options are on the table. Yeah, I'm very open-minded about this.
Yeah. And, you mentioned sort of self-actualisation. There's a lot of talk about wokeness in the military, especially coming from the US. I know that in the past you've been a sort of back-to-basics kind of person in terms of military culture. What's your view on wokeness in the Australian military, and is it a problem?
Look, I think when you join the ADF, when you take that oath of enlistment and you put that flag for the first time on your left shoulder, you leave part of yourself behind to become part of the whole, which is the team, and your job is to serve our country under one flag and do the mission. And that's what's so good about ADF. That's what's so good about service in the ADF. And if we start dividing people by individual attributes, whether it's race, religion, sexuality, gender, it's toxic. So I think we should insist on standards in the military, and we should insist on a fair go for all and equal treatment for all. And that's why I think identity politics is so toxic to cohesion and the team spirit, which is essential to fighting morale and generating combat power.
But you don't see a cultural problem that needs to be fixed at this point? It's just something that you would keep an eye on?
I just think it's basic leadership and reminding the ADF that their job is to fight and win Australia's wars if called upon, and that is what they have to think about all the time. Otherwise, why have a military? Every other area of public policy will take care of itself, but defence is very, very unique. And, there's no points for second place. One of my favourite quotes is from Ernest Hemingway, who said, "I've seen much war in my lifetime and I hate it profoundly, but there are worse things than war and they all come with defeat." And so that's why we've got to have an ADF that can step up and defend us if necessary.
Is it strange to you that Anthony Albanese would be open to sending troops to Ukraine but not Peter Dutton? Why shouldn't we back our support for Kyiv with boots on the ground?
Look, I think there's been no formal request, as I understand it, and this would be a decision for the Prime Minister and the National Security Committee of Cabinet, and it should be considered there and then. And I think saying that here is to support what Peter Dutton said. We also have to consider our interests in the region, of course, and so there's a lot to play out yet in the negotiations, which reached an inflection point on the weekend in the White House. And so I think this is a decision for a government of the day when a request comes forward. That's not ruling it in or ruling it out, But I just don't think we should rush. I just don't think we should rush to commit young Australians to a conflict without a request. And so I think Peter and I are very closely aligned on this.
The door feels a little bit more open with you, though, than it was with Mr. Dutton.
If we win government, he'll be my Prime Minister. Yeah. So it's as simple as that.
On AUKUS. So we've seen Donald Trump cozy up to Russia, call Vladimir Zelensky a dictator and whack a 25% tariff on Canada and Mexico. Do you trust Donald Trump to do what he says? And in your view, is AUKUS a lock under his leadership?
Look, I think AUKUS is a lock under his leadership, but I think Donald Trump, as a president, studies your hand very closely. And I think it's incumbent upon the Prime Minister to demonstrate a strong hand in future negotiations. We've already seen what Bridge Colby said, and that is to increase defence expenditure. And we've also seen in the exchange with President Zelensky that America is keen on rare earths. And so there's a couple of things that we could be doing with the United States to strengthen our hand as things unfold over the coming months and year. And I think something like a geopolitical offtake agreement with our rare earths. We've got 4% of the world's rare earths reserves in this country. These are the sorts of things that we need. And I think the Prime Minister is flat-footed. He's not agile. And he should have gone already to meet with Donald Trump and to establish that relationship. We've got a great hand. We've got strategic depth here, which is what we're going to deliver through AUKUS. We're already delivering it through Darwin and Alice Springs and the joint facilities that we have there. And of course, we have an abundance of rare earths and critical minerals, which will be essential for military and space applications going forward. So we just need a bit more of we need a stronger leader. And that's why I hope Peter Dutton becomes Prime Minister in the next few months.
So we need to sort of come bearing gifts, really.
Not come bearing gifts. Stake our position and argue it. Bit of hip and shoulder.
Okay. In the Oval Office.
Well, I think in any sort of negotiation, you need strength.
Yeah. Well, Malcolm Turnbull would say that as well.
Absolutely.
From his experience dealing with Donald Trump. So, I mean, AUKUS is a massive undertaking, and yet it's sort of become an article of faith. It's almost sacrilege to question the plan. What makes you so confident that Australian industry can deliver? And perhaps more importantly, can we rely on the US and British submarine industries?
Sure. I think AUKUS is first and foremost a political project. It's a technology project and it's an industrial project. And the Premier mentioned that we've had changes in all three countries now of government, and AUKUS is enduring. The technology and the industry part is going to be very difficult, but I'm confident we can make this happen with good political leadership. And I've got to commend the Premier for his leadership at this state and contrast it, frankly, to WA Premier Roger Cook, who yesterday felt it necessary to insult the Vice President of the United States with a rather insulting term. And I think there's four political leaders in this country who are essential to the delivery of AUKUS. It's the Prime Minister, it's the Defence Minister, it's the South Australian Premier, it's the WA Premier. Now, Roger Cook would not say that to a Chinese leader. He would not say that of an Indian leader. Why say it of Vice President Vance, particularly after what we've seen over the last couple of days?
Does that sort of thing put AUKUS at risk? Or
I just think it's reckless, it's undiplomatic, and it's not in the national interest.
Defence industry has been, especially the small and medium-sized enterprises, they've been fairly unhappy with the government and the pace of new capability programs. What would the Coalition do to shake things up and get more money out the door?
For defence industry?
Yeah.
Look, I made this comment a couple of weeks ago. Whenever a defence prime comes to Parliament, whether it's the British, the Americans, the French, name a country, not far behind them you can feel the shaping influence of their government. And I think it's really important that the Australian government starts backing small and medium enterprises. I think the global rules-based order, as everyone likes to refer to it, is dead and buried. That's very clear. Under President Trump, there's an America First agenda. And a lot of countries are going to start looking at their own backyard and reindustrialising. And I think we have to have important relationships with the US and the UK, particularly on defence industry projects, technology projects, but it's high time that we started investing in our own country. It's time we started investing in our own small to medium enterprises and helping them scale up so that we can export to our allies as well. And again, it's about building the strength of our hand relative to our partners.
Labor came to office with quite comprehensive plans on how it was going to deal with SMEs and overhaul the way that procurement happened. Do you credit them with any sort of success in that area, or do you think maybe the plans are okay, but the delivery is falling short? What's your
Look,
view?
we're seeing some great Australian companies come online. I was in Melbourne last week at AIM Defence, which is using directed energy to destroy drones, shoot down drones. Incredible. And I know the Deputy Prime Minister's been there. It's a great story. The question is, for those companies, what do they do long term? If they're not getting job orders from our Defence Department, where do they go? They move offshore. And what we're seeing is Australian small to medium enterprises either having to shut shop here or move offshore. Neither of those are in the national interest, particularly if we're going to reindustrialise.
And I think I'm getting the signal, so I think that might be as much as we have time for.
Thanks, Ben.
Thanks so much to Andrew Hastie, the Shadow Defence Minister, who's vying to become Defence Minister in a matter of weeks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, mate.
Thank you so much, Mr. Hastie and Ben, and for the Top Gun reference. There's at least one former fighter pilot here in the audience who I'm sure could cash every cheque. On a more serious note, hearing you talk about the calling of the Australian Armed Forces and calling on young people to join the Anzac tradition was really good to hear. Paul Starrick will now host our final panel of the evening with leading defence industry CEOs and leaders. We have Craig Lockhart from BAE Systems and Dennis Cleary from Hanwha Defence Australia. Thanks. Staz.
Okay, good. Welcome, gentlemen. Let's get into it. Might start with you, Craig. I'll pose a question that the Premier posed earlier about public support for AUKUS and the degree of public confidence in AUKUS. And we've seen things like Donald Trump say he doesn't even know what AUKUS is, and the UK submarine program having major issues, particularly with the crucial Rolls-Royce reactors. You've got an extraordinary degree of experience in the UK industry and on nuclear subs. Can we really believe nuclear-powered submarines will ever be built here in Adelaide?
Well, in short, yes. And I think both the Premier and DPM Minister for Defence answered the Trump question very well. I think, as recently as, the visit with Sir Keir Starmer, revalidating the commitment to AUKUS, DPM's personal meeting with Hastie, and indeed, the ongoing commitment. In fact, a few hours ago, President Trump's announced the establishment of the Department of Shipbuilding inside the Oval Office. Goes to reaffirm the US commitment to generate both that resilience in establishing a fourth production line, which is supplementary to both the UK and the US, but also goes to commit that national resilience thing and the Australian contribution to that effort. On the second thing, the recent Infrastructure and Projects Authority, which is a department of Treasury and Cabinet of the UK, does as it does every year, looks to assess every major capital project across UK government. Out of the 46 defence projects in the UK, the Rolls-Royce core factory was given a red rating, which means that without significant readjustment intervention, both schedule and cost may not be achieved. Well, in the last few weeks, Marie Eagle, Minister for Defence Procurement, has adjusted the scope. Rolls-Royce have adjusted the production timelines, and that was set against a dreadnought first-of-class core delivery. SS and AUKUS is some way after that. We've mapped out the optimal pathway, and we are, remain confident that we can achieve both the dreadnought first-of-class, being part of that dreadnought alliance, but also meet the optimal pathway. So I think we've got a lot to be confident. And I point to Hunter. We've done this once before. Not only are we building frigates, we forget that we've established a national enterprise, a new shipyard, a new workforce, new equipment, new processes, and we're now exporting that outcome back to the UK. So I point to, in recent years, we've done this. And I think, AUKUS brings a level of complexity with regulation and legislation, but we're working with partners that have decades' worth of experience in doing that very thing. So I would say yes.
Dennis, I'll turn to you. Hanwha's surface-to-air missile forms a critical component of South Korea's missile defence. What gaps in Australia's missile defence do you think you could fill?
Yeah, well, to draw inspiration from Mr. Hastie earlier, I guess a 90s reference is Hanwha's sort of the new kid on the block. We're not an established prime, we're sort of learning and we're getting there. And I think part of that introduction is that we actually, drawing on Korean technology, we're one of the few enablers in the world to draw on a country that actually has end-to-end, tip-to-tail, the entire lot of technology in a missile system. We were fortunate to showcase some of that with the Chunmoo at Land Forces last year, which Deputy Prime Minister was kind enough to come and have a look. We'll also have that there with some other capabilities at the air show. But I make that point for a reason. It's not very well known that the South Koreans have that sort of technology. We are aware of the Goyo decision and who the strategic partners are, and we respect that, and we would love to work with them. But I guess what we would like to say is that we have capability where we could fit anywhere in that system.
And what particular gaps do you think you could fill here?
Well, I think the gaps we can fill is speed to capability. We can get that to Australia very quickly. The Chunmoo system is in use in other nations around the world, not just Korea. So we feel that drawing on that basis and that actual experience, we can bring it here and hopefully interoperable with the other systems and get that going.
Craig, in terms of the challenge of building a nuclear-powered submarine industry from scratch, as I said, you've worked in the UK industry. Do you think Australians appreciate the degree of difficulty involved? The Premiers and others have compared it to a moonshot. Is there an appreciation across the Australian public of the scale of the challenge?
I think not yet, but I think that's more alive in South Australia and West Australia because, we've got sight of and visibility of programmes. On Friday, I visited USS Minnesota, part of a rotational force. There was no doubt in my mind, that West Australia was alive to, a new requirement, evolving requirement, and the positivity from the crew, left me under no illusion that, they are pleased to be here and pleased to be supporting the agenda. In South Australia, I think we've been through that journey with Hunter again. There's a visibility of what AUKUS brings in terms of jobs, economic benefit, supply chain involvement. But, as the other states become involved in the AUKUS programme and the work that we're doing with the Australian Submarine Agency on establishing the awareness around social licence and what a nuclear-powered submarine programme actually involves, I think we'll slowly bring that up as legislation comes to bear, as we understand regulation, and understand that this is the most highly regulated, safest industry in the world. And again, we're working with partners who have delivered this for decades. I wasn't around in 1958 when we last did this, but I'm sure, we went in with the same level of confidence.
The sods were turned this morning on the Skills and Training Academy. How important is that sort of on-ground, something to focus on, something to see in terms of building public confidence?
Massive effort. As the Premier Malinauskas said, the skills agenda is one of the most important things to get right. Again, with the amount of effort we're putting in on early careers in supporting the broader shipbuilding programme, I often tell people we're throwing the kitchen sink at it. From apprenticeships to degree apprentices to interns to graduates to postgraduates, it's everything. We've got to, increase the supply pipeline. AUKUS will bring a level of security classification, at a worker level. We need, foreign students to come in en masse such that we have a broader pool to recruit from. So, it's a really important milestone that was achieved this morning. And as one of the net consumers for that resource, we can't put enough effort into that. But, I think what we've achieved both in West Australia and South Australia is a great start, but a long way to go.
Dennis, your firm signed a deal at Land Forces last year, including drone development.
Yes.
We've talked about Ukraine and the experience there. Doesn't that show we desperately need drones? And how quickly can we get them? What should we do?
Yeah, so I think the short answer there are yes, and as soon as possible. So last year we did sign an agreement with a very great Australian company, AMSL Aero. They have an amazing expertise in drones and are the only company that we know of that have untethered flight, which they achieved in October last year. That is an amazing achievement for a small Australian company like that. Now, we recognise at Hanwha that we have capability back in Korea, but we partnered with them and thought these guys are ahead of the game. So what we think at Hanwha we can bring to a company like that is that manufacturing expertise and that general industrialisation. We have an amazing facility down at the Avalon region. I think that's why AMSL Aero are really keen to partner with us and get on board. They've seen what we can do to help them. We recognise their technology, and I think it's a great partnership going forward.
Could you explain what you mean by untethered flight and how that might better protect the Australian environment?
Well, the difference between a lot of the tethered flights that have occurred at the moment is essentially the difference between untethered and tethered. Untethered is essentially more advanced.
Oh, okay.
So we feel that more advanced capability, that they have that pedigree, is something that we can bring quicker and hopefully to production. It's also interesting to note that AMSL are one of the few companies that have had some funding from ASCA currently as well. So I think that shows from a federal government perspective that they have confidence in this company doing that as well.
And what sort of scenario would that be able to protect from?
Well, I think any scenario that the Force Posture would ask to do. It also has some civilian capability, but I think from a defence perspective, we feel that would be something that the strategic view within government and security cabinet would allow that company to sort of go ahead and do. Similar to Loyal Wingman, I would say, from the Boeing perspective, that has its own role and its own capability, and that will be set by the RAF. I think that's a similar thing.
Craig, just over a year ago now, the Hunter class program was scaled back from 9 ships to 6, and then steel cut on the first one of that in June. Is the project now on track? Well, is it on track for the first ship to hit the water in 2031?
Yes.
Yeah. Why?
Some facts and figures.
Yeah.
We've now got 27 units, which is about 9 blocks. There's 12 blocks in the ship under construction at Osborne. There's about 2,500 people on the shipbuilding programme. We've got about 8 of the 12 design zones now through final design completion. The remaining zones are to do with the combat system, which was always lagging. We'll lay the keel first quarter next year, and we've, out of the 160 contracts out to the supply chain, $2.9 billion worth of spend already committed, with a further 50 contracts this year placed with the SME community. It's bang on target, still within contracted date. So, again, all credit to the Osborne workforce. They're doing a cracking job.
Was it unfairly maligned in some quarters, the Hunter frigate program?
Well, you know my view. I've been a staunch supporter of Hunter as I am. I think what the general public doesn't see, and it's focused on the ship and the frigate, but the obligations under the Hunter contract was to establish continuous naval shipbuilding for Australia. And that was the investment by the government in the new yard, the mobilisation of the equipment, which was brand new, the recruitment of that workforce, 2,500 people and growing, the establishment of an early careers framework with things like Findon Technical College, the engagement of supply chain, and at the end of Hunter was the lasting, objective of us being able to design, build, and deliver complex warships on our own. Most of the Australian public don't understand that level of commitment and objective, and that's what's playing out here, and that's why I'm so confident that we're just repeating that exercise in AUKUS with just a further degree of complexity.
And how then are you positioned for the next step in that process of air warfare destroyer replacement?
We continue to evolve the design. The UK is now up to kind of 5 ships under production. We continue to work with the ADF, specifically the Navy, on looking at the next generation, batch 2 of Hunter. And already, because of the kind of time taken and the evolution of technology, we're working on replacement technologies, obsolescence, and possibly new requirements. So that design process never stops. But again, I go back to the commitment. There's now 600 design engineers, of maritime capability, who are Australians doing that day in, day out. That didn't exist 3 years ago.
Dennis, I just ask you, we've talked about Ukraine and the importance of sovereign capability. Why do you think Australia should be exploring relationships with regional defence industrial powerhouses like Japan, South Korea and so on?
Well, in my time within Hanwha, what I've learnt within the Korean and the Japanese space is that they're very good at speed to capability, technology transfer and cost. They do it quickly and they do it well. We hope and understand that we want that relationship with the US to continue and to flourish. But as was noted in the Australian on Monday, it doesn't hurt to have a plan B. And perhaps there could be more opportunity to look at these nations and what they do. I know that Japan's currently with Mitsubishi Heavy Industries for C3000, but within Korea ourselves, we are the #1 defence company in Korea. We have a lot of capability, and I think what we have proven in the past is it comes quickly, it's cheap and it's on time. But on that note, Hanwha remains committed within Australia to support things like the regional sustainment framework that the US DoD has set up. We've had a contingent from the US there a few times to look at the facility. So we want to support who we need to support. We're not here for just Korea. We want to support Australia.
Final question for you both.
Yeah.
Looking forward, where do you see the advancement and the degree of the sovereign manufacturing capability? How effectively do you think we'll be performing into the future?
I think very well. I think, as Craig has touched on earlier, and all the speakers, we have an amazing supply chain within Australia. They remain able and ready. Some of that supply chain, I think, Ben's point earlier of what can government do, I think as defence primes, we can engage more, and we're doing that. And I think that's what's obvious amongst all the primes is we're looking to these SMEs to find that capability that we know we don't have, but we can assist in manufacturing and helping it get there. So I'm really confident because that technology base is already in Australia.
Craig?
I think likewise, I measure what I see, in BA Systems. We spent, nearly 96 million in R&D last year, which was the highest ever, with partnerships such as Flinders University, South Australia and others. We know the level of investment that's coming through the PhD programmes and the pace by which we're encouraging innovation. And indeed, the stimulation of supply chain by throwing them real, defence capability problems and asking them to bring forward their ideas and wares. And, I think the fact that we're exporting shipbuilding process back to Scotstoun and Govan, and, people in my old country will hate me for saying this, there's something called Project Osborne, stands to testimony, of the high quality workmanship, but the entrepreneurship mind of the average Australian and what we're seeing coming out of the academic institutions. I think the future's exceptionally bright. We've just got to keep it going and keep, getting the backing of government with funding.
Excellent. On that positive note, it's time to draw to a close. Thank you very much, both of you, for your time.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks, Daz, Craig and Dennis. It's such a pleasure always to hear from our defence industry chiefs. We love using Defending Australia to highlight your truly nation-building, nation-shaping work. It's been fantastic to have the crew up here, but also to have so many brilliant CEOs attending today. We are committed to continuing to advocate for our defence forces and for our defence industry. Our next Defending Australia event will be in Canberra in June, where we will take the debate about our most pressing national security issues to the nation's capital. I look forward to seeing you all there. And for anyone who would like to catch up with industry colleagues now, there are some drinks about to be served. Thank you so much.
Very much so.